Hi, and welcome to this interesting session about research for our Adelaide Space Conference for alumni. Now, we've got some very interesting guests. First person, Monica Stankiewicz, is presenting the concept of robotically repairable regolith structures. With the Artemis projects going ahead, there's going to be the requirement for longer and longer habitation on the moon and beyond. And repairing these structures can be very costly indeed. So she has some interesting things to say about that. Look out for her talk. Following Monica's talk is Suptik Bhattacharya. Now, Bhattacharya, I think that's right, is also looking at space architecture. His concepts are to explore inflatable and unfoldable structures that have very practical and cost-saving applications on the moon, beyond, but for me, more importantly, and for all of us, have some really great applications here on Earth, with emergency housing becoming more and more necessary with all of the environmental effects that we're seeing at the moment. And our third speaker, also very interesting, is Mike von der Nahmer. Mike has a musical background that he's applying to space research and other Earth-based researchers as well. Mike's looking at using sound sonification as feedback to enhance flight controller performance. The idea that we rely on our visual sensors for feedback is good, but to enhance it with audio is even better. And I'll let Mike tell us more about that. So let's introduce our first speaker. Monica Stankiewicz, as I said, is looking at how the Artemis project is going to necessitate longer periods of lunar habitation, which will logistically cost the lunar base projects much more money, as I said, and this could be potentially high. So she's looking at a way to address the need for repairing these. Monica is currently undertaking a PhD at the University of Adelaide here and is focused on the strategic structural logistics of repair in lunar habitat design using sintered regolith blocks. I'll leave Monica to explain what that is. She has a real passion for space architecture and often presents educational talks of space architecture to inspire the next generation. Monica, I'll hand it over to you.
No worries. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'll just set up my screen. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, so what I've done is I've just got a bit of a question there looking at how will our lunar architecture be affected by this focus on repairability. And I've got a bit of an image there that I took whilst I was experimenting with some blocks and a rover with some of my fellow architecture students at the Andy Thomas Centre. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the rovers, the blocks, and perhaps the foundation side. But looking at my actual PhD topic, so the structural logistics of repair in lunar habitat design using sintered regolith blocks, initially when I looked at that, I noticed that it actually spans a rather broad variety of topics. So not only does it look at in situ logistics, it also looks at that Earth to moon travel logistics, so trying to reduce how much we transport there and reduce the cost of establishing a base or a long-term presence, not to mention looking at that semi-autonomous working relationship, creating maintainable architecture, and looking primarily at that additive manufacturing focus. So if we break it down a little bit further, my central focus is repair and how that relates to the materials that we use, the automation of the robotic construction, the designing for the environment. And there are these interesting relationships between them, which include perhaps the design for robotic ergonomics. So changing that focus from designing for human tradies to designing for robo tradies, and looking at how we can mitigate or use that the locally available resources and adjust those building processes and perhaps the structural system that we use. So one of the things about lunar architecture, not quite as simple as building on Earth. We can't just send out human tradies. Our human tradies would require iced coffee breaks or smokers or whatever. They're also very fragile when it comes to the lunar environment. Now, I'm sure if you've been following the rest of the conference, you would be quite aware of the fact that space is hard. as the saying goes. And particularly when we're designing for the moon, would have to consider things like dust, micrometeorites, radiation, thermal cycling. And so perhaps we might not have the energy resources to spend on scaffolding. As you might see in this lovely structure here, has a lot of scaffolding to create this beautiful structure. But is that really a wise use of our resources? Could we use a design a bit better for the lunar context? So looking at our actual robotic workforce, some of you might recognize these robots as, the Viper prospecting rover, as well as the scintillator concept that's been proposed. So the thing about the robots, they are great if we design them for the purpose, which takes a bit of time. And they're great at doing easily repeatable jobs, but then something you can't necessarily just tell them, go pave this area or just go build something. That's something that we're still addressing at the moment. And so you might be able to see in the lower images there, we've traditionally relied on humans for these to create these larger structures or these block-based structures. So looking at these block-based structures, if we go with the traditional brick, one of the things that we might notice is that, let's just say some of the bricks are disturbed and we need to remove one and replace it. We then start getting to this concept of what I call advanced space Jenga, in that, quite frankly, if you remove the wrong blocks, the rest of the structure slumps, depending on the configuration of the blocks, what type of blocks that you have. Naturally, in a lunar environment, if we've got a regolith shelter, that's something that we'd want to avoid. So particularly the image on the right there. So in the last year or so, part of what I've looked at is this rather simple way of looking at, okay, if we have these different brick patterns or brick shapes, and if we combine them together, what happens if we start removing some of the blocks below? Will the rest of the structure stay up? And through this bit of an iterative process, I realized that we love hexagons. Hexagons are great. However, if you're dealing with a dome structure or a curved structure, hexagons can be a bit tricky, especially if you're trying to reduce the amount of types of shapes that you're using to make it easier for the robots to identify, shift them, and use them. So following on to the topic of repair, generally to repair something, you need to be able to build it first. And so that's part of what I'm exploring at the University of Adelaide. And in looking at these block-based concepts and working with a few other enthusiastic and passionate students, we've come up with a few concepts. So one of them, this one was created by Jamie, which looked at these interlocking blocks that would slot together quite readily, have a beautiful visual texture. And he took this concept and evolved it from these polyhedral stone modules that were invented in the late 17th century. So that's something where, okay, we're looking at this modern design with modern rovers, but we're using concepts or solutions that people have come up with hundreds of years ago. And so one of the things that in particular with the lunar environment, it is extreme, it is distant, it does have a lot of challenges to it, but the really great thing about us as a human species is we love problem solving. So we have another concept here, which is a core-belled concept, which you might, if some of you are Star Wars fans, recognize from one of the films where Luke was hiding out on an island. He was actually hiding out at Skellig Michael, which existed several, 1,000 years ago. So one of the great things about humanity is that as we've expanded nomadically or looked after sheep in remote places, we've come up with ways of stacking blocks together, which is called corbelling in this case, so that they can be built simply with few resources needed to enable that except for the nearby blocks. Now, whilst this might work for Skellig Michael with the atmosphere in a lunar context, if we're looking at making sure that it is completely sealed up, then we'd need to actually develop the block shapes towards helping create a more solid structure or wall and making sure that they fit easily together so that the rovers have a simpler task of actually building that structure. So continue on. So these are some of our prototype blocks, which we took and had to play around in the at the Andy Thomas Center in the X-Res lab in the sandpit. And one of the things that we noticed was that it's all well and good to model whatever you like, in the virtual environment. But at the end of the day, it makes sense to take the prototypes and actually start building those structures in a context similar to the one that we're aiming for. So one of the things that perhaps I might not have noticed whilst modeling is that sand can get in between my blocks. That could be a consideration. I haven't tested these ones out in the larger regolith pit yet, but I'll give that a go next. Oh, wrong way, sorry guys. Now, we do have some other concepts under development as well that reflects on this particular technology and that particular problem, especially while solving the process of constructability or autonomous constructability for rovers or robots so they can repair it later. But if I show them to you now, then I won't have anything to show you later. And, I'd rather have something exciting to demonstrate to you guys later on. So keep your fingers crossed and we'll keep at it. So in short, in my last few seconds, what I'd like you to generally remember. So there's this rather important concept, which I perhaps didn't cover as much. It is cheapest to make design changes for a project at the beginning. So if you've ever tried to build a house and asked your builder to just add an extra room right when he's mid-construction, I reckon you'd be able to see how that conversation would go. Whereas if you have that conversation at the very beginning, when it's in the design stage, he'll let you know what the cost is and he'll generally be a bit more amicable. Through this reflection or designing for ease of repairability, we can make our structures more sustainable and translate some of those lessons learned back down to earth. So already taking that block-based structure, looking at it through this lens of repair, it's already changed the way that we might construct the layers, put them together, and make it easier for robots as our future tradies, as opposed to humans out there in suits fumbling with blocks. Finally, this is my email if you'd like to get in contact or have any questions, and a evocative image looking at a house and a bunch of robots. And so that I would like you to imagine perhaps what that would look like on the moon from a, crow's eyes perspective or Star Wars perspective or a top-down perspective, depending on the language that you use. Thank you very much.
That was awesome, Monica. I really got a lot out of that. I realised that from my own experience in robotics, we often took something people would assemble and had to simplify the assembly process and the parts being assembled so that a robot could assemble them because they were so constrained in their ability and dexterity. And in doing so, we found that the parts that we designed for robots to assemble were easier for people to assemble, and that almost negated the need for robots. But it certainly means a lot of improvement for habitations in space and beyond, and also for applying these lessons that you're learning back on Earth. We don't have any questions from the audience yet, but please feel free to ask any questions and post them on the Q&A. One question I may have is the parts, the buildings that you're assembling and then repairing, are they do they need gluing together or do they sort of sit together on their own?
Yeah. That's actually a really good question. So with the technologies that we're looking at, or these built construction processes, they don't need any mortar, importantly. They don't need any binding agents. They are dry stacked and they are self-supporting as they are built. So you don't actually need any scaffolding.
Oh, it's really good. Well, any other questions? If not, we'll move on to our next guest. And Monica, thank you again for what was a very entertaining and interesting talk. I wish you well with your research endeavours.
Thank you very much. I feel like that was a very small snippet of the broader project I'm working on. But I'm glad it was well received.
It was. Any glimpse at any other snippets of what else you might be working on, just for say another minute?
Let's see. So one of the things that I've generally noticed in working on this project at the University of Adelaide is that I've had this amazing opportunity to collaborate with people that specialize with machine vision, with robotics and programming them to be autonomous, with people that are materials engineers or geotech focused. So I've been able, I think one of the things that will really catapult these sorts of projects or the snippet a lot further is the fact that I have that very multidisciplinary approach and I'm able to just have those conversations and tap someone's shoulder and resolve any issues.
Again, a wonderful presentation. I love that you used very easy to understand concepts like Jenga. We can all relate to Jenga and how fragile those stacks can be. And congratulations on penning the new term I've never heard before, robot tradies. I can just see the robot tradies in overalls looking for a can of oil to drink when they get too hot. So thanks again, Monica.
No worries.
Cheers. Our next speaker is Suptik Bhattacharya ji. Suptik is from Calcutta in India, and his basic presentation is about building houses that are prefabbed and that may be inflatable, but more importantly, the ones that he's looking at the most are, I believe, the ones that unfold. And as I said earlier, these structures have many applications both in outer space as well as on Earth. His brief career summary states that as a master's student in urban design at Calcutta, he specialised and is specialising in deployable space habitats. One thing of note is his research has made him a winner at the recent 2021 Martian Challenge. So well done, Suptik. We're honoured with your presence here tonight. His talk today aims to explore the evolution of space architecture, particularly the advantages of deployable organic origami structures. So without further ado, I invite Suptik to present his interesting talk. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I will just share the screen. So today I am going to present my undergraduate dissertation, which I did on use of deployable origami structure in space architecture and its application in space architecture and its application to achieve the UNDP Sustainable Development Goals. So how I came into space architecture is quite interesting because I had from very childhood age been very fascinated about space, and with time I did my bachelor's in architecture from Jadavpur and later on master's too from Jadavpur. And how I formally came in touch with space architecture is through the space station design workshop by University of Stuttgart, where a team of scientists and engineers and students built a self-sustainable lunar habitat, and then gradually I also did a work as a space computational designer at Aga Space Studio, and I have like ambitions to contribute more in the field of space architecture. So starting onto the presentation, so we will look into the abstract of the research, and then we will look into the how the research is done, and then finally we will move on to the how the space architecture evolved with time, and what are the space habitats, types of space habitats, and finally the deployable origami structures, and at last we will look into the benefits, applications, and finally the conclusions. So moving on to the abstract. So the main aim of the research is to explore and understand the field of space architecture through detailed understanding of evolution process and case studies, and finally understanding the scopes and advantages of deployable origami structure in the field of space architecture. This paper also represents the application of space architecture in the terrestrial environment through understanding the application of deployable origami structure to achieve the UNDP Sustainable Development Goals 1, 3, 7, 9, 11, 13, and 17. So these are all the UNDP Sustainable Goals that are being achieved. So if you look into these images, you can see that how with time we are moving towards habitation in space. Like we have the initial one, it's the ISS, you can see, and then the concept of Transhab is being developed, and later we saw the development of Marsha AI by AI Space Factory, which is a 3D printed habitat. And we can see a picture of the Saga space architects building the lunar, which is an origami type deployable structure. So let's move on to the research methodology. So how the research proceeded is through the evolution of space architecture. Like we looked into how the space architecture evolved with time, and we did the comparison of space habitats, like how the space habitats being compared, and we did some case studies, and over that we understood the advantages of origami space habitats over others, and then we looked into the different type of deployable origami structures, And finally, we move on to the benefits and then application. And through that, we got through the SDGs that we can achieve through the deployable origami structure used on Earth. And finally, we got the conclusions. And also, we can look into the how the future would be. So moving on to the, if we look into the evolution of the space architecture, we can see that from the very old ages, we have fascinations to go to moon, look into the stars. But formally, globally, we can see that the journey to moon, we can see from Earth to the moon by Jules Verne in 1865. Gradually, we saw several concepts in coming up, like space elevators concept. 1950, we saw the space station, like spinning space station. And finally, when we are going to develop something, real developments happen, we can see that Goddard space station concept being developed by Goddard Aerospace Company. And then in 1964, we saw the Voskhod spacecraft by Soviet space program. And 1966 to 74, we saw the Apollo space program, which finally made man to land on moon. Now, we are gradually doing the suborbital flights to Soyuz 1, Soyuz 2. Finally, we have the space station ready, the Skylab, and also the important contribution by Roman Loewy is to put a window, which is also an architectural contribution, great architectural contribution. And then in 1981, we saw the space shuttle program being started. 1986, we saw Mir space station, another space station being developed by Soviet space program and ISS. And then 1997, we saw the Transat by Konstantin Adams. And finally, in ISS, we saw in 1998, the development started. So in future, like we have a plan for Lunar Gateway Station by NASA and ESA. So this is how we can see that how the developments happen in recent times. But we can also now see that how the developments of space habitats actually happened, like the concept of Nautilus by Bigelow Aerospace appeared in 2013. 2015, we saw the Mars Ice House by SEARC. It's a concept project. Beam, which is another inflatable habitat being planned, which is being attached to the ISS node, that is by Bigelow Aerospace. And then we saw Marsha by AI Space Factory, and NASA being developed this as a 3D printed habitat. And finally, in 2019, we saw the development of Moon Village, which is also a collaborative study by ESA, MIT, and SOM. And then we saw 2020, we saw the how lunar space architects, lunar by space, Saga space architects being come up. And in 21, we saw the Mars Dune Alpha, which is being built by Big and Icon. So you can see that how gradually the space architecture being evolved from past to the very present structures. So if we now look into that, how it developed is through that we can see that prefabricated structures are being used at very first place. That is we called as class 1 space habitats. And if we look into the class 2, that is the inflatables and origami structure, which are being developed nowadays by space architects, like it is being developed by on Earth, but it is deployed on this in this space. So that is the origami, that is the class 2 habitats, and class 3 is the 3D printing habitats or the ISRO utilized habitats. So you can see that how the technology readiness level. So we have the technology readiness highest for the class 1, but the lowest for class 3 habitats. So in the latest stages, we can see that how we are moving from class 2 to class 3. So this research is mostly focused on the class 2 habitats and the origami, how the deployable origami habitats works. So after case studies, we did some research on how the deployable origami structures work. And we found out that there are several types of origami patterns that are being utilized in the space sectors commonly. So we can see a vertical axis below pattern origami. So this is how it opens up. So this is the direction how it opens. And so it have the highest amount of volume increase from the initial volume, that is about 11 times. And we can gradually see, you can see the Cresling pattern origami structure. It opens in the upward direction. And then the central axis below, so you can see that how it rotates and it just makes a whole volume. So it becomes the central axis below pattern origami. And finally, the Cresling pattern origami, and then Yoshimura pattern origami. So Yoshimura we come with like the lowest of the 3x times the deployable structures being transformed. So you can see that how the percentage of volume increase with each of these deployable origami structures. So we can see that when we are moving from Earth to Moon, we need some habitable space as well. So this is the great solutions to have a intermediate staying for an intermediate period of time, like from a very short period to the very long period. So for very long period, we usually prefer going for 3D printing or ISRO utilization. And for very for short period, we can usually prefer going with some like landers, which have like Eagle landers we have on the Apollo program. But in the intermediate stage, we usually prefer going for origami structures. So that's will be a great solution. So now moving on to the what are the benefits we saw. Like it is easy to pack and deployable differently because like it's a very compact structure being deployed in space. So it is quite easy to take from Earth and deploy on to other surface as well. So, and it is adaptable to uneven and rugged surfaces. We saw that can be made into modularized with minimum changes. Like we need, so there are maybe some need for modularization for growth of colony, maybe, or maybe for to accommodate high number of people so on space. So it can be modularized with minimum changes, and it have a high structural strength, which in fact gives a better hand than inflatable structure in the debris mitigation, because we know that in space there are full of debris. So with these rigid structure panels, we can easily have a high structural strength, and it is also repairable because these are the panels that are being used. So we can see the applications in these of this structure in on Earth. We can show the analog habitat, which are like MDRS in Utah, or something like Habitat Mate on Brazil, what we have. And we can see the housing solutions for extreme environments. We can see military camps as well, quarantine houses, which are really required for nowadays. We saw in the how the COVID hit us and we needed quarantine houses. So deployable houses can be easily be made into quarantine houses, as it is also can be scaled industrially, and it can also act as a disaster relief shelters. And then finally, what we came up with is the deployable origami structure holds huge potential to be utilized as a deployable habitats in extreme environments. It is also a sustainable solution for temporary housing on the Earth. And for the future, so for the future, we can think of the AI being used in the architecture and urban design, and how the concepts of urban design in hostile environments and habitation works. That can be the future researches as well. So thank you. That's the end.
That was very good.
Yes.
I really got something out of that. I hope we all did. Again, thank you very, very much there, Sukdik. Just a couple of questions that I've got, and please feel free, everybody else, to join in with questions. First of all, what's next in your research? You've certainly, thank you for a comprehensive overview of structures for space, their history, and of course,
yes,
what's expected next. Your specific research, what is your next few steps that you'd like to see?
So the next steps would be to understand that how the class of habitats being utilized in the space sector. For example, we need a great master plan, an integrated master plan to develop for the space. So we cannot just go there and do some research and then again come back. So it will take huge time to build the base up again. So we need a concrete plan to develop from the very basic part to the very longest part. So how the urban planning and the urban design will work in this sense in the hostile environment, because in hostile environment nobody have no experience right now, but with time we will get some. So that's the next part of the research. Yeah.
I must say that there's so many aspects from the material sciences to be explored to not only unfoldable and inflatable structures, but furniture and the fittings within. One thing that really amazed me, and I'd like everybody to consider this, the structures change size, they change volume. And so if we're to design something that's to be built inside a tunnel, a lava tube, or some cavity that we might find on another planet or extraterrestrial body, then your buildings can be put inside of one of these spaces and expanded so that you can have a ready livable habitat with the benefit of the radiation shielding provided by the surrounding regolith and whatnot. And that's just one of many things that come to mind. I certainly urge everybody to think about that. Then we have one other question, and the question is from Sajid Tarim. Thank you for your question, Sajid, which asks, how structure are different in space compared with structure on land? So he's looking for what differentiates the two structures. Over to you, Sukdik. Can you tell us the basic difference between land and in orbit or extraterrestrial structures? Sukdik?
Yes, I lost you. Maybe some internet connection problem.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. So could you please let me know? Like, I didn't got it.
Yeah, the question's up on the QA, but Sajid asked, what's the difference between ground and orbital structures that you see differentiating the two?
Okay. Yeah. So in space, you can see that there is a hard vacuum that is there. In Earth, we have a lot of atmosphere. We have the atmosphere to breathe. We have atmosphere to like control our pressure. Like our body is adaptable to the 1 atm of pressure on Earth. But on space, we have no atmosphere. So it becomes a really tough challenge to deal with the vacuum. So we really need some habitable volume to contain the astronauts or contain the crew members inside a particular volume to make it livable. So inside the habitat, so not just making a volume in space is important, but we also need like supports like the life support systems and the other structures to maintain the atmosphere, the humidity, the radiation protection shelters. All the things are required in the space. So it's tough to be there in space than on Earth.
Yeah, sure. Well, you've certainly given us lots to think about, and I always know that as a fallback, I could use your technology to develop new and exciting caravans for driving around Australia with. Thank you, a big thank you to you, Suti. Our next speaker is Mike van der Naan, and he's a very interesting fellow. Mike is, how would I say? Yeah, Mike is a composer, a music composer, a sound researcher, and a music therapist. So he's probably a very interesting person to hang around and have some interesting discussions with. I certainly look forward to Mike's talk now coming up. Mike is currently doing a PhD at the German Aerospace Centre, researching basically the sonification of air traffic control data, converting visual cues to many cues that the traffic controllers have to deal with into sound cues. And this will, I understand, heighten the controller's situational awareness. I think this can be a very exciting area with many spin-offs for Earth technology. So I look forward to his speech. A little bit about the technology. Sonification represents the most varied forms of data using different musical parameters. So we're turning data into music such as pitch, volume, timbre, and other musical means. So that transfer of information creates a value add to the information that the listener receives. What was interesting about reading his research is that our auditory system is much more sensitive than our visual system. And so I think Mike's onto something if he could pick something very in tune with how our brains work. So I'll hand it over to Mike to introduce the sonification of air traffic control and how they may be used in future space travel. Mike, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes, I can. Okay.
Oh, okay, good. So then I will start. So yes, so I come from a different world. I have worked a long time as a composer and sound researcher and music therapist. And some of the projects ranging from BMW, where I developed car sounds, to Grammy, to Kenwood, to many, many other applications. And so today, I will introduce you to my work that I'm doing at the German Aerospace Center. So you can see our little house there, and it's very nice. We have this little airplane field behind us. So every time I look out of my window, I can directly see the planes coming in. And my research really is the key center of trying to figure out how can I develop a system for air traffic controllers that will help them in the future to work with a soundscape that helps them to deal with the new kind of data that they will get. This, of course, is for a future that has the data link where basically the acoustic channel will be free for them to listen to the sound and music world, but it's really hoping to engage them and also to bring new information to the acoustic channel, to the air traffic controllers in different many forms. So one of the problems that we have, if you just look at visual information, it's very clear. So if I invite you to a talk, or I invite you to dinner or whatever, then you basically know what you will get. So if you look at visual information, it's always very clear the information that you get. But if I, on the other hand, play the sound to you, I hope that you were able to hear the sound, then you are wondering, what the heck is Mike talking about? And that is one of the key problems that I have in my world, is how can I create a sound that actually tells you information, and what do I need to do for that? And so some of the applications are kind of resembled in this very nice sentence by Steven Spielberg: our ears lead our eyes to where the story lives. And that is really one of the key components about the things that I'm thinking about, is that I don't want to say the visual information is more or less important than the acoustic or auditive information. For me, the interesting part is really where we are working together. What is your visual information, and how can I work with you to enhance it or to bring in different information to that? So one of the very simple concepts is, of course, that small things sound small and big things sound big. And another concept that comes with that is the different ways of how images or visuals can come in connection with sound. And so one of the forms would be, for example, underscoring, which all of you know when you watch a movie and then you see a scene, and then I put some emotional music to the emotional scene. And so it's basically creating an underscore. It's doubling the emotion that you already have in the images. Another way would be polarizing it, which means that you have a neutral image. For example, imagine some kind of trees or some kind of other images, and I will enhance the information through the music that will tell you a different information. For example, if you see trees and I will kind of play some kind of horrific music, then you probably will know, oh, there might be something going on in the woods, maybe there's a witch or something else. And then the last point in the cognitive theory of film music is the attention guidance, which of course is very important for my work, how you can actually guide attention somewhere. And so I will show you now a very, very short example of the same movie with two different snippets of music. And all I want you to do is just to experience the visual information, the acoustic information, and maybe you can later write me how you experience both videos. And so this would be the first one. Oh, sorry. And here's the other one. And what you most likely will have done, as many of my students have done, or every time I show this, actually, you will have different experiences. Some people have the experience that some of the forms move faster, or they move from inside to outside. Or there's a different emotional component. But the whole thing that I wanted to show with this is that music can change the experience of visual information. So that's one very important element of what I'm doing. And so when working with sound and connecting all of these different worlds, I have, again, different elements, which all you know probably from gaming or from, again, watching movies. So one aspect is I can give a certain scene, a certain sound, a certain kind of music. And so, for example, if you would be the director and I would work with you on your movie, then we could think about what are the different scenes, what are the different cuts, what do I have to do there? Do we have music in scene 1 and scene 2 and scene 3 or whatever? But in general, it's basically every kind of different scene gets a different kind of music, which we then connected with a very, very basic example. So in this example that I will show you briefly then here, it's really just the idea of an aircraft coming, flying into a sector, going out of the sector and flying away. And so for me, there's now a couple of things that I can already look at just in this very, very basic example. So I would have the ability to approach the sector, which could be one sound. Then I could have a sound for the entrance to the sector. Then I could have a sound inside the sector. Then I could have a sound shortly before the aircraft is leaving. Then I could have a sound when it's exiting, and I could have a sound when it's departing. And so in just this simple example, you can see you already have 6 different elements. And so in my work, I'm trying to now connect all of these different scenarios and try to figure out for each of these different scenarios that we have, for example, crossing aircrafts or flying towards each other or other accidents happening. I'm trying to really create the soundscape for them. So in the past, what all of you know from machines that you're working with tools that you're working with, we have short auditory warnings, which could be, for example, something like this. So the aircraft is coming. You get a brief sound, then there's silence within the sector. And then you have another sound when it exits. But the idea that I find much more interesting, and that's also where I'm working on a new kind of system, is what would happen if this actually would be more like a film score. So if the information actually would translate into a movie score, which could be, for example, in this case, something like this. So now you can, of course, say, well, Mike, this doesn't make any sense because once the aircraft is inside the sector, I, as an air traffic controller, don't need that information. That is not really the point. The idea of what I'm trying to show you is that there's a different approach to working with sound and music already. And that I'm just thinking about how could we create soundscapes in general for operators that they can work with in different formats. Another way of thinking and working with music and sound is thinking and working in layers. So before you were, when we were talking, I told you about the direction of scenes. So we have one scene, two scenes, second scenes, and so on. And the other one, working in layers, which you maybe already know from all the gaming. If you do a lot of gaming, then there's a similar structure needed. So what we're doing there is, if you show me the same kind of movie, but then we, for example, say maybe we don't have enough space for the data, or maybe we just want to use it differently, we're thinking to structure the music in these different layers. So you can think in an easy way, we have high layers, we have middle range layers, and we have low range layers. But the broad idea is that, of course, in the very end, you want to hear all of these different sounds and soundscapes that come, because otherwise I failed to show you that there are several things happening at the same time, and the music can actually show that. And so I have this very, very short example, which is basically a loop, but now you can listen to it and you can see that there are three simple layers that develop over time. And so what I'm working here with as a composer, which is very nice for me, is that because I have a huge frequency range, I can really use instruments and rhythms and ways of musical parameters in different forms to give you that information. Another project that we're currently working with, yes?
We're just running a bit short on over time. So
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm almost done. So here's just a couple of other examples that I wanted to show you. So another one is where we just use an experiment in music therapy to use vibrations with patients. And so we kind of trying to connect them with the idea you can not only hear the sound, but you can also feel it. And this is for patients that have that kind of some kind of from a delirium. Then we are also thinking about using the connection of movement and sound in different forms for patients, but also for other ways. Then we have soundscapes, of course, that we can also think about. How do they work? How can we kind of create the sound space? What does the top mean? What does the bottom mean? Then we can think about autonomous driving as well, how to communicate with cars and with future approaches. And so there are many, many ways of how we can use soundscapes in the future and think of using them for living, for work, for relaxation. And so there are a couple of things. So music and sound can be used as a form of communication, as I showed you. Then we have acoustic feedback, where we need the music and the sound to tell you some kind of information. Then we have physiological effects for body and mind, of course. Then we have soundscapes. And then, of course, we have music as a form of touch.
That's amazing.
And that's
so I have to cut you off there,
presentation.
but there's so much material that you've covered so comprehensively. I'd encourage you, Mike, to post some links to your work And I'll make sure that everybody gets access to them. And that way they can follow this amazing area more. But we do have to move on very soon, like in about 10 seconds. What I want to say, though, is that the idea of sound providing information is very important. I've worked in very noisy environments where, for example, power station control rooms, there's flashing lights everywhere. They don't make any sense. And I'm thinking of launch control, where rockets are launched. You can reduce the number of people and increase the effectiveness of those left behind if we can introduce very clever sound. For everybody in the audience, if you want to think of soundscapes, one thought that came to my mind was the concept of the Doppler effect, where you can hear the sound of a train and know whether it's coming or going. So it's very interesting. And I'd like to, any last words?
I mean, one other famous example of sonification would be the Geiger counter, where you basically know the atoms are changing. But again, the idea is, and I think that's really the new work that we're trying to do, is think away from just short auditory warnings to how I could create the soundscape that you get the information, or that helps you to deal with the information that you have on the other side. That's really the main next.
Wonderful. Okay, now everybody, I'd like to hand you all over to Kelly Yao, who will be telling you more about the upcoming next networking session. So thank you from all of us here at Research.